general terms. The general terms around vehicle grid integration, but to make sure we have everyone on the level here, we're really talking about the practice of intentionally integrating electric vehicles with the electricity grid to maximize the use of renewable energy resources, increase the efficient use of grid infrastructure, and avoid otherwise necessary grid upgrades. And importantly, also benefit the driver participant in doing this. We're looking at two primary forms of vehicle grid integration. One is managed charging, which is generally understood tacitly to be unidirectional managed charging, as well as bidirectional managed charging, which is the two-way flow of energy, managing the charging and managing discharging. We refer to bidirectional charging as V2G when it concerns the grid, and I'll say another word about that in a moment. And you know, that stands for vehicle to grid, and the foil to that is V1G, which doesn't have a neat way to say it in words, but just to differentiate it. And as many of you will have seen in the report, we rely on those abbreviations. We talked a bit about trying to say these things more in words, but the abbreviations became quite convenient for the figures, and so we wanted folks to be tracking from the text to the figures using these abbreviations. So I mentioned bidirectional charging in a way that is done in concert with the grid as being key for vehicle grid integration. So we'll step through a few terms and we'll get to this question about what is parallel. So we see many different terms in this sort of, I would say, VGI universe. But I would distinguish a bit between, and that probably should rename this table, in fact, distinguish between vehicle grid integration set of terms, which is overlapping with bidirectional charging terms. And so to take the latter first, these bottom few terms, including grid parallel exporting bidirectional charging, grid parallel non-exporting bidirectional charging, islanded bidirectional charging, and vehicle to load, those all involve two-way power flows to and from the vehicle. And now the grid parallel piece we call attention to, and that was actually based on feedback from one of our reviewers, which I thought was spot on, is really about when you're exporting power in a synchronized way in concert with the grid, which would be different from when you are doing islanded bidirectional charging, where the location is disconnected from the grid, and not having to be synchronized in terms of, things like frequency regulation and so forth. But also that the site is totally in an islanded instance, that site is totally separated from the grid. And we also introduced a more general term, vehicle to load, which we're primarily referring to when you're just plugging something into an outlet on the vehicle, which so many of them have these days. For instance, our household Hyundai Ioniq 5 has a power port that's just a 120 volt outlet in the trunk area. And we also have the option to get an adapter for the power port of the vehicle that would send energy out of that power port and along an extension cord to some particular device or load of that sort. So this orange box here is really sort of the bidirectional scope of terms. And I'll say we often hear vehicle to building or vehicle to home, V2B, V2H. Those can be a little bit ambiguous. Sometimes they are islanded, sometimes they are grid parallel. And so, you'll hear those terms in this universe as well. But they're generally a subset of one of these terms that's already here. And then the vehicle grid integration, sorry, I thought I had another. Sorry, the slides got a little out of order there. So in this box here, this is what we're really talking about with vehicle grid integration, where there is that synchronization with the grid, there is that coordination with the grid. And for the purpose of this analysis, these three categories are really what we're talking about. The managed charging, which is when, how, or where EVs are charged, and the managed bidirectional charging, which can be exporting to the grid, or it could be just powering a home while that home is still connected to the grid. For instance, if the power needs of that home, or rather, if the export power from the vehicle isn't exceeding the power needs of the home, there may not be that actual export to the grid, but it will need to be synchronized with the grid, to make sure there's no issues there. For this analysis, we really treat the two grid parallel bidirectional charging categories as one, sort of folded together. We don't discriminate between whether things are exporting or non-exporting, just whether they're feeding energy in a grid parallel way. And that is largely an artifact of how the modeling is done. The EVs in the analysis are really the load of those EVs is treated in aggregate. And just the level of aggregation and the way the model is constructed doesn't really lend itself to distinguishing those two. And in terms of just quantifying high level grid benefit, we think that number, even with those two things combined, is still quite valuable. All right, did we cover the parallel question satisfactory? Is there any follow-up on that? And I did lose the chat, so I may need help if there's something coming in the chat, Jim. There we go.
Myron, you yourself and respond.
Okay, all right. I've got the chat back now. All right. Yeah, I'm seeing the note on hourly. Yeah, and so that is we'll get to more of the assumptions and the methods here, but when in this analysis, it is on an hourly basis. So that could be done in a number of ways. The model doesn't discriminate between different kinds of whether it's a utility sending a signal or an aggregator, or if it's a dynamic rate with high adherence to those signals, that kind of thing. That's all good to go in terms of this approach. Okay. There's not, to my knowledge, a standard setting body for these terms, although yeah, that could be helpful in the future. And yeah, export refers to crossing the customer meter. That's a good clarification there. Appreciate that. All right. And as noted above in these comments, I didn't mention it yet, but we conducted this analysis in collaboration with Evolved Energy Research. They had really excellent tool in the form of two models, Energy Pathways, which is their demand side model, and RIO, which I'll have to look up the acronym. Let's see, Regional Investment Operations, which is their supply side model. And it's on RIO where we worked with Evolved Energy to actually create novel modeling structures for vehicle grid integration. So that was really the biggest piece of collaboration there, was actually they made recommendations about how to construct it based on how these existing models worked, and we worked really closely on assumptions and so forth, which we'll get to some more of those. Oop. But I don't want to skip the key research questions. The research questions that brought us into this collaboration with Evolved are threefold. One, to what extent do varying levels and types of vehicle grid integration reduce the need for additional grid infrastructure and the associated costs of that? Two, what incremental system benefits does electricity discharge from EVs provide over managed charging alone? So that's what incremental benefit are we getting from V2G over V1G? And then three, how much must vehicle batteries be used to provide those benefits for discharging to the electric grid? These first two were answered by this modeling exercise with Evolved, and this third question was actually answered by some off-model calculations based on the results that my colleague Dave Reichmuth conducted. So a little more about the scope here on the left. This is just looking at California, although the modeling the modeling exercise itself does have some connections to the Western grid, but the results are isolated for the state. That was particularly important because, as many of you will be familiar, state regulators want to know what's specifically going on with their state, and something broader isn't always necessarily as persuasive or informative for that purpose. We focused on light duty battery electric vehicles, which are your passenger cars, SUVs, and pickups in that light duty weight range. That's certainly not to say that medium and heavy duty vehicle segments could not do vehicle grid integration. Indeed, school buses in the higher medium duty and heavy duty range are, have been proving vehicle grid integration can work, including V2G for some time now through various pilots, demonstrations, and even a few slightly broader scale programs. We focused on light duty here for a few reasons. One, we sort of wanted to isolate this opportunity within the light duty vehicle segment. These vehicles are parked, and I'm getting into the reasoning here, about 95% of the time, according to the Department of Transportation. And so it seemed like really sort of obvious thing to use those vehicles, those batteries on wheels, especially when they're not rolling their wheels for much of the time. Uh, Again, on the reasoning for light duty, California has achieved over 25% EV sales in 2024. We'll see about 2025, but we know that EVs are the future. And so there may be some hiccups given current policies and revocation of other policies, but California is really well on its way to a high level of EV sales, and they've already reached nearly 2 million EVs on the road by the end of last year. And I noted there are some vehicle integration pilots going on. Much of the V2G has been, as I said, in the school bus space, but that's beginning to change. And we focused on level two charging locations because they have what I think of as Goldilocks flexibility. They're not too slow that you risk undermining the ability to meet energy needs, as could be the case on level one. And level two is typically not so urgent that it doesn't have the flexibility to advance or delay charging like many direct current fast charging locations might. And so this seemed like a good subset of the charging to focus on, that it sort of has this Goldilocks flexibility.
I'll just jump in here. At
Yeah.
10 million electric vehicles, California with 10,000 megawatts, about 40,000 megawatt hours of utility scale grid batteries, has roughly 3 times as much battery on wheels as it does uh, in battery banks.
Yeah, that's a great addition. And I'm seeing this question about level two power. So, and that's a great question. We did uh, the actual level two power is a little bit under the hood in terms of how it's modeled. We worked with Evolved Energy to use some NREL data and the EV Pro Lite tool in terms of the managed charging side to come up with essentially what an average kilowatt charging pull would be across all the vehicles. And under, sort of that implicit in that is that vehicles aren't plugged in all the time. Um, and a vehicle may or may not be able to heed a shifting call and so forth. And I'll talk a bit more about that. There were other similar calculations on the battery discharging side where we did start with 9.6 kilowatts and then sort of did several discounting factors. Yeah, so we're seeing some good examples also get called out where there's been some microgrid and V2G going on. So want to share the light duty battery EV stock that we're assuming. This trajectory largely adheres to the Advanced Clean Car 2 standard, which would ramp up EV sales through 2035 to 100% in that sales in that year. And so we assume roughly that trajectory while also accounting for vehicle retirements, assuming vehicle retirements are, the schedule of that is roughly in line with internal combustion engine vehicles as well. And we did, many of you may know that the waiver for Advanced Clean Cars 2 has been revoked. And so, we do at the point of that, we were pretty far along on this analysis. And I think even if it had been at an earlier stage, we would have wanted to stick with a trajectory like this because that is the future that we're working towards. So as I said, 2035 is sort of that key point for vehicle sales. But in terms of reporting on results, we focused on 2045, which I now have in the box here in orange, primarily because that is the year when many of the other state goals come to a head. So the vehicle sales trajectory will have come, that goal will have come, which is not just an ACC2, it's also an executive order, and as well as California's electricity and energy system goals, including renewable energy and sort of net zero economy we would like to think come to fruition. So that's why we choose this year 2045. The simulations were run through 2050, however. So this 30.1 million EVs is a number to keep in the back of your mind as you see some of the results coming up. That's not all the vehicles that will be participating. We'll get to that when we talk about the scenarios in just a minute. But that's sort of the broad number. Now, as I alluded to before, the way it's actually modeled is with the energy demand. And so the energy demand is really that, that key piece that we're managing for vehicle grid integration. But that we sort of back into that through this number of vehicles. So before I explain this chart, you'll see in the title, it refers to feeder types. This is another structure of the modeling, which is that the supply and demand is broken out by sample feeders. And the feeders are residential, commercial, and industrial. And there is also a separate feeder for DC fast charging, which is not shown here because the DC fast charging was excluded from the vehicle grid integration, but there would be a baseline charging behavior for that too. It would not change in this analysis. And so in this chart on the vertical axis, we have the percent of total charging, which is done as such because it can be scaled by the population of vehicles. We do maintain the baseline across all the years. It doesn't change as we go into the future. And here we're showing in blue, which is the one that is, high on the left, low in the middle, and high on the right. That's residential. And then commercial and industrial have this sort of higher in the midday area. The residential baseline does assume a fair amount of adherence to time of use rates. We came up with these curves based on some CEC data, that is California Energy Commission data that Evolve was able to secure from that agency and for current EV charging, and we smoothed some of the peakiness and aggregated it across the major service areas as well. But this is the baseline here, and around the baseline, you can imagine a shape surrounding that in the modeling acts as a bounds for the extent to which charging could be advanced or delayed, and the same with vehicle discharging. We call that the charging envelope. I think when we were talking with Evolve, in the paper, it just refers to it as a sort of a shape that bounds the ability to change. And that's really just to reflect reality, right? EVs are still primarily for mobility. We don't assume that they're going to do, even though with VGI you could change location because it is a battery on wheels rather. We assume that where those level 2 charging loads are assigned, they're generally going to remain on that sample feeder type. And we have a few other constraints on the shifting of charging that are meant to more closely bound it to reality. One is variable O&M maintenance, which I don't know, I can't remember if we call it exactly as such in the paper, but that's essentially a cost that the grid faces to call that battery $100 per megawatt hour. That is designed to sort of make the driver neutral in terms of potential battery wear and tear. I think That piece we did get a lot of discussion because you can also manage charging and discharging to keep the battery wear down and perhaps even improve the battery health. But we felt like that was a reasonable assumption to make in this analysis. And there's also a penalty that it's a slightly different level for charging versus discharging, but it's called the state of charge penalty. That's supposed to reflect sort of the consumer preferences to keep the battery at a relatively higher level. And so with those kinds of constraints, including the charging envelope, we do feel like that makes these numbers pretty robust that we'll see here in a minute. All right. Yeah, and to the question here, there are many different ways to do both managed charging and discharging. It doesn't necessarily require advanced metering infrastructure. Telematics, as noted, is an option. And it doesn't have to be the utility. There are increasingly a number of aggregators who, collect vehicles on their platform or aggregate them to then participate and call vehicles based on different signals that aggregator might receive or market prices and so forth. All right. So onto the scenarios. In addition to going hourly and providing, value, I think in advancing the conversation on this, we also looked at quite a few scenarios, the most number of scenarios to compare it to the baseline that I'm aware of. And again, this is just the level 2 charging, which breaks out to roughly just under 60% of the light duty vehicle load. And we broke our categories into 3 scenarios because if you recall from the research questions, we wanted to look at different levels of vehicle grid integration and different types. So we wanted to say, okay, if we have a low level of VGI, a medium or high level, what does that mean? And if that enrollment is V1G versus a mix versus V2G, then what does that look like as well? So we have 3 groups: low, which is 20% of the level 2 charging load; medium, which is 50% of the level 2 charging load; and high, which is 80%. And just narratively, you can think of these as low being VGI remains a bit of a niche practice. High could be that it becomes very widespread while still recognizing that getting to 100%, is quite a tall order. And may, as we'll show, may even not be ideal. And then medium enrollment, which is somewhere in between. And I'll just one note on what I said about 100% not even necessarily being ideal. This is for hourly managed charging. Certainly, absolutely, in the real world, time of use rates are really a critical sort of entry point for vehicle grid integration. We certainly consider that as vehicle grid integration, but for the purposes of this analysis, we're really looking at that more granular, more dynamic, you could say, management of EV loads and how much of that do we need versus a baseline that does indeed include some managed charging. And to just put some numbers on what I've just described, we took within each group, we ran a sweep that essentially covers having within that group, all of the VGI enrollment be level 1, to be a mix, or to be all V2G. That's probably simplest to see in the low enrollment group at the top there, where we go from 20% V1G, which is to say all V1G, to a mix of 10% each, and then on to 20%. It's essentially the same for medium and high with just some intermediary steps, which for medium and high get a bit interesting, and we'll look at that as well. So the first set of results I'm going to show you, we're just going to look at the bookends for each scenario group. So I've highlighted the low, or rather I've highlighted the all V1G here for each group, 20, 50, and 80, which is all V1G. And then we'll also be seeing the V2G bookend, and I'm just color coding these so you have some orientation to this next chart. The V1G for each group will be in blue, and the all V2G case will be in orange. Those results look like this. So we're looking at electricity system savings for each scenario group in 2045. And we have annual savings in billions of dollars on the vertical axis. And then across the horizontal axis, we have three groups, low, medium, and high, and the V1G in blue on the left and V2G in orange on the right for each group. And we can see finding number one for our report. VGI produces electricity system savings, whether you're doing V1G or V2G. And finding number two, V2G creates incremental savings over V1G alone. And you can see the jump is pretty big. I think it's at least 4x even at its height, 4x or maybe a little more. And just to give you a sense of scale relative to the electricity system, on the low end, so if you look at the far left blue bar, low V1G only, that's 1.8 billion. That's about 1% of electricity system savings in that year. And if you look to the far right, it's $11.7 billion, which is nearly 5% of electricity system cost savings, again, in that year 45. So I think that's significant. I mean, 1 in 5 don't seem like huge percents, but if you think about that in terms of avoided costs, if you think about being able to achieve something in that range across a number of years, I think that really adds up. And I think as we think about that, important to pull back and just state, would think something that y'all appreciate already, I'm sure, which is that these savings, these electricity system savings, can help contain costs for the ratepayers who are ultimately paying for the system costs. And so, that's another sort of motivating factor for this work and advancing the recommendations that we'll come to. See, does the model incorporate any measure for degree of circuit constraint, locational benefit? So the model, it has, I think it's a little bit apples and oranges in terms of this question, Claire. The model looks at different feeder types, and so it can, within those sample feeders, it has that sort of granularity of detail, but it's not a one-to-one with the real world, although it is, a representative sample. And then the locational benefit, let's put a pin in that, and I'll show you what I think gets at that, which is where in the system do these savings come from? And we'll show that in just a second. And then after that, we'll see if there's any follow-up questions. All right, so we looked at the bookends. The next thing I want to look at is we show many of the rest of the results for the medium enrollment case. I'm sorry, I'm looking back and forth between screens. Looking at the medium enrollment group, we looked at that as sort of the example for many of the rest of the results that we'll see. For a number of reasons. It demonstrates some of the nuance to the findings that started to emerge in the medium and high groups. And as sort of a middle case, it seems like a fair sort of way to anchor and focus these results. Okay, so that was the bookends. We're going to look next at a chart that shows the results for the medium group, and there will be 5 different bars for each of these rows of medium group. So again, we have annual savings in billions of dollars on the vertical axis, and we're looking at different scenarios across the horizontal axis. The scenarios are labeled by how much V2G they have in them, and each scenario adds up to 50% of VGI overall. So the two we've already seen are the far left and the far right, 0% V2G, which is all V1G, and 50% V2G, which is all V2G.
And what jumped out on this on this metric, Sam, was that the overwhelming majority of the benefit was achieved at 25% enrollment.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, and that,
not everybody
yeah,
has to play in order for this game to work.
right, exactly. And I think that was a really key and interesting finding that emerged out of this, which is, as Jim said, when you get to 25% of the level two load participating, the returns begin to diminish. And that is sort of the second part of our second finding in the report, which the first part was, V2G provides incremental benefits, and the second part was, and with diminishing returns, right? And so we're seeing this, an example of this in the 50% group here. And notably, if I were to show you the 7 bars or that of the high enrollment group, then we would see the same thing at 50%, or rather at 25% of enrollment, which is a different amount of load between 50% and 80%. But at 25%, you really start to see the bars start to tape, the incremental benefits start to taper off. So that is an interesting wrinkle. It says a few things to us, which is, as Jim said, not everyone has to participate to get the bulk of the value out of this. Um, and the piece under that is when as the incremental benefits decrease, so too do the benefits per vehicle if everyone's participating on an average basis. So I think there are some implications there for how we're designing programs. So I'm seeing a question here about the warranties. So the way that CARB has regulated that before was within the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. They included requirements, sort of longevity requirements in that regulation, which is great. It's certainly consumer protective and an important feature. But the way that battery discharge for non-driving purposes within that was poorly defined, and so didn't doesn't really provide sufficient protection, perhaps, for most folks who might be interested in discharging their vehicle, to the grid, or even as backup power potentially, which is also an important thing for folks to be able to do with their vehicles. And so again, with the Advanced Clean Cars 2 being not off the books, but with the waiver being revoked, with it being the subject of litigation, absent that, we would have loved for CARB just to go update the warranty requirements. It's a little more complicated now, but that's sort of the state of play there. Yeah. Sure. And the benefit, this benefits piece is also really important. And I've been reporting electricity system savings, which is what the electricity system would see value from the service that, the hourly V1G and V2G services provided. But that does not include netting out whatever incentive the driver would be receiving from that. So if the driver should be receiving an incentive, and so that would essentially come off the top of these total amounts. And I think that's something that needs a bit more work. It came up as a big theme in V2G, business and tech forum that I attended early this year. But yes, this is all in the grid frame benefits for the grid. The consumer piece is also super important and complicated, but that the importance of that is not lost on us. And so, well, we have advocated for, benefits to the driver participant, of course, and that is a big piece of the follow-on work to this. This is grid oriented because it's primarily pointed at the regulators who have and utilities who can get this going. But the consumer piece is super important. It's super important, and I take that seriously. All right. So we were seeing here just the example of the medium group, and so these are the net benefits. To level down, I know we just introduced a lot more color. So to orient ourselves, we have the same vertical axis annual savings. The horizontal axis, the bottom is not zero because we're showing both the savings and the incremental costs of each scenario compared to the baseline. We do have the same five scenarios across, which is the medium group going from all V1G to all V2G within the enrollment. And now we're seeing within these bars what where the savings are come from. So to begin with, the net savings are the dark blue dot that you see generally at the top of the bar. That's the net savings. That level is what we saw on the last slide. And within that, we're seeing all these different sources. So the yellow, which is the top stacked bar across all of the five columns, is electricity delivery. And that is both transmission and distribution, but like 90% of the benefit there, maybe not exactly, but far and away the majority of the benefit to the electricity delivery system is distribution. And we can see that the scenario that's got on the far left with all V1G, which has no V2G, provides a pretty good chunk of savings on that already. And then we enhance that as we go across to V2G. The next bar down is electricity storage. So we're saving more and more on electricity storage as we add V2G. And we found that within the storage category, quite a bit of that was actually the long-term storage, which in the model is storage that holds energy for 24 hours or longer. So that I think was an interesting wrinkle. The thermal generation is in green, which may be counterintuitive. I hadn't thought about how the designer assigned these colors. But thermal generation is in green, and we can see that also has savings that grow across scenarios. Renewable generation is in the light blue near the bottom, which there are some slight dynamics in there. You get more renewable savings and then less. That has a little bit to do with, I think this group will appreciate the dynamics between, efficiently utilizing solar, and then also as you get more and more V to G, actually doing a little bit more wind on the margin. It's very marginal, but that's actually why that I know that with this group there would be questions about why that doesn't have a cleanly increasing trajectory, and that's why. The fuels are the cost, and that again is a little bit of an asterisk. We're reporting electricity system savings, but the model is actually looking at the entire energy system, and we felt it was important to name some of the trade-offs here between in the later years of the analysis, and including 2045 here, where there are some because of V2G, there are some dynamics in the relative costs of electrolytic hydrogen versus biofuels and other elements in that fuels bucket for the energy system more broadly. So we're talking about the electricity system, but you'll see in the paper even there we have a little asterisk saying we're kind of scooping in these fuels because they include both e-fuels and other fuels. Okay. Any follow-up questions on this? Because I know there's a lot going on here. Looks like there's been quite a bit of chatter. See, I'm not seeing any direct. Let's see. Can I expand a bit more on what is encompassed by renewable generation savings? Yeah, so that's essentially avoiding building renewables. So even though quite a bit of the VGI is being done to soak up more renewables, the ones that we are building, we're using more efficiently. It sort of is the general point there. So. And to be totally clear, we're still building a ton of renewables. I don't have the slide at my fingertips here, but you could, if you were to look at the baseline and scenarios for how much renewables are built, include solar, it's a ton. And so these changes are, marginal, just reflecting some changes when we add vehicle grid integration as a resource for the grid. So don't think that having renewable savings means we're not still building a ton of renewables. We absolutely are. We're just not quite having to build so many. Yeah, I'll just say, Myron, I agree with your point. Absolutely, we're gonna have to pay drivers to participate. And I think the I think there's just a lot of experimentation, trial and error going on in terms of getting folks on platforms, whether it's an aggregator or a utility. Um, but I do think, and we'll see in a few slides, if folks can get sold on that they can get paid for doing something that actually they won't have to do all that often. That may be able to increase folks' comfort with enrolling, and that'll also feed into how much they may or may not, the level of that incentive and how much they may or may not need to get paid to do that. Um, and yeah, I think how much like what aggregators are taking off the top is also a really important dynamic. This analysis doesn't comment on that, but absolutely. Um, I think that it's not stated explicitly in the recommendations how to deal with aggregators on that regard, but certainly important for the policy discussions. All right. So just to report a little bit more here in terms of how some of the numbers break down on a per vehicle basis. This is the fourth finding of the study, which is that actually, let me go back to this. Let me go back to this. I want to say another word about sort of how we get these savings, which is that quite a bit of the electricity delivery savings are from shaving peak demand on those distribution feeders. So that's important. And I alluded a little bit to using our renewables more efficiently, but the fact that we are using more renewables is contributing to needing less thermal generation. And then the EVs become the storage and avoid some of that storage, particularly long duration storage. All right. Uh, for real this time, on to this per vehicle discussion. We're again still in the medium scenario group for 2045 as the example group here. And the number on the left, 500 to 12,000, that's the range of annual grid benefits per vehicle per year in 2045. And as you might expect, that 500 is the V1G only scenario, and then the 1200 is the all V2G scenario within that group. So it's a bit of a range. From the transportation side perspective, again, we're keeping the consumer in mind. These are not the benefits necessarily the driver would see, as we've discussed. But we did want to note that over the lifetime of the vehicle, the number you're seeing on the right, if you assume a 12 and a half year vehicle lifetime, if that vehicle could achieve those savings every year across the vehicle lifetime, it really adds up even on the per vehicle basis. But again, the driver needs to see a cut of that. Absolutely. $25. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And certainly the California electricity costs are a factor, a dynamic in this that's important for the policy side conversations as well. Appreciating that comment. All right. So we're just to orient ourselves again, we're gonna now look at some numbers that came just out of this 50% V2G in the 50% group. So this is why this bar is circled. We're gonna look at some numbers that are specific to that single scenario, which is how much are the batteries actually used? And so this was one of our off-model calculations, but we found that if the vehicles that are enrolled participation is spread pretty equally across those vehicles, then the energy equivalent mileage would be about 700 a year. So, to put that in the context of 10,000 miles a year for an average driver, more or less. Depends on, if it's a car or a truck, it might even be higher per year. But that's what we're looking at, just a few percent essentially in the miles equivalent. of the energy use on that vehicle in that year. Now, as I said, that assumes, you know, peanut butter spread of the participation across enrolled vehicles. Um, but if some participants could become super participants and do more, or you know, perhaps some participants are opting out more often, or they're enrolled in a program that calls them less often, that could certainly be less. But on an average basis, that's what we're looking at. We felt like that was actually pretty modest in the grand scheme of the energy going through the battery in any given year. And another interesting tidbit, in the highest V2G hour call of the year in this 50% scenario of the medium group in 2045, only 2 million of the vehicles were called. So that's 2 million vehicles within 8 million vehicles that are enrolled, within 30 million vehicles that are on the road. So that's that, you know, we need to be able to scale V2G to the millions. But you know, it may not be so urgent to scale it to the tens of millions, which I thought was an interesting finding and an interesting wrinkle. All right. And I'm seeing some chatter in the chat. I think that's just complimentary to the discussion here. I'm not seeing any particular questions, but someone please raise a hand if there is a question in there or otherwise. Okay. So that brings me to our recommendations, which I think will be no surprise, but must be said, which is one, to prepare the electricity system and plan on VGI. So in that bucket of you know, activity, we see standardizing and conformance testing to communication and other standards protocols, technology for visibility into the grid, whether that's advanced metering or other. We're sort of agnostic to that, but we know that we're going to need to be able to get grid visibility if we're going to be calling vehicles on an hourly basis. And to include EVs as a distributed resource in planning, which we're actually starting to see a little bit in the high DER or distributed energy resource proceeding in California, which you know, still a lot of work to be done there, but it's on the table, which is good to see. Secondly, establish systems for efficient interconnection. This is the recommendation that reflects the problem that it just takes too long to get interconnected for V2G on the system through Rule 21 or otherwise. So we want to see efficiency and throughput. You know, that could be done a number of different ways. You know, maybe it's the cutoff for, you know, the kilowatt level of export that puts EVs into a category with more scrutiny than they may truly need. But anyway, that's, you know, we got to deal with interconnection. If we're going to get to the millions, you know, to say nothing of the tens of millions, we've got to make that more efficient and increase the throughput. Thirdly, support and incentivize drivers. So we've been talking around this in the chat and verbally here for a bit. We reported the grid benefits, but VGI by definition must benefit the driver as well, and so that piece is really important. We also see the need to provide incentives for the upfront costs to participate as well, particularly among low-income households. Fourth, requiring bidirectional charging and capability in vehicles. This is something that we've actually been working on for some time. UCS co-sponsored SB 59 in California, which gives the Energy Commission in the state the explicit authority to make bidirectional charging capability requirements for vehicles, including but not limited to light duty vehicles. And we continue to engage on the implementation of that. We see that as important for a number of reasons. One, when a vehicle is sold, you don't necessarily know where it's going, how much, you know, it's going to be needed on the grid based on where it lives, and vehicles change hands. So they're not going to live in the same, well, many vehicles, not all vehicles perhaps, but many vehicles will change hands. They're not always going to be in the same spot. And within that, it's important to reflect that I don't have the California specific statistic, but within the US, it's roughly two-thirds of household vehicles are purchased on the used market. And so we also feel it's very important for folks who buy on the used market, which are typically lower income, or the used market reflects more of the low income segments of the market, that those folks aren't, captive to the choices of new car buyers, that we need to seed that market with bidirectional capability vehicles as well, including bidirectional capability that goes all the way to vehicle to grid. And then finally, we talked about this a bit, but the battery warranty protections. They vary by automaker, but certainly we don't want use of the battery for discharge to non-driving purposes to void that warranty. That's a huge disincentive to do this. We think there could be a number of ways to deal with that, like some sort of digital or virtual odometer, for instance, that reflects, miles equivalent of the energy use, for instance. But we've got to deal with that as well, because it's a huge structural disincentive for folks to participate. So those are my main slides. It looks like we're running right up on time. We did it. We had a little discussion along the way. I'm happy to take any final questions here. And let me just double check. I don't think I have a hard stop either. Just gonna double check the calendar. That's my brain in terms of scheduling. Yeah, okay. So I'll go ahead and exit out of that. I'm gonna try to stop sharing. There we go. So that's the deal. There's even more detail in Evolved Energy has a even more technical document that I welcome you to look at if you want to see, for instance, what we call the spaghetti diagrams, which shows a sample day, how much the charging is shifted relative to bulk system storage, things like that. So I will drop the link to that I'll drop both links. I'll drop for the main paper, and I'll drop for the Evolved Energy piece. Jim, I'll count on you to facilitate the question taking with the raised hands, if you don't mind.
We get to Peter and Myron. I want to ask if Amory can clarify for us the comment he just put into the chat on the about 21 forms of monetizable value, and how this study is focused on only a couple of those.
Well, I don't have the list in my head, but there's kilowatt hours, there's peak related capacity equivalent attributes, and there's a hell of a lot of ancillary services that are quite valuable. And you don't have to have a smart grid to do them. It's a tiny example. Alec Brooks sent me a beta circuit for my EVSS, and when I recharge my EV level 2, the EVSS every second looks at the grid, measures the frequency, decides whether the grid is short or long electricity, and adjusts the charge rate accordingly. So I'm actually dispatching 7 kilowatts of a very valuable service called fast grid regulation to the Western Interconnect. And if they knew I was doing that and paid me what FERC says it's worth, I'd make another few bucks a day recharging off my rooftop solar. That's one of the smallest terms, but some of the reactive and frequency and voltage support ones are very valuable. The Mobility House, I think, was the first to qualify a car as a power plant in Germany in 2018 as a frequency support resource, frequency regulation. And I think it's an interesting puzzle. How do we move quickly and still design 1547 and other standard and regulatory systems that will be open to all forms of value as their means of implementation and business models emerge, so that we don't have to make a big fix later that disrupts what we just did.
What jumped out at me very early when I looked at the report was that half of the benefits were on the transmission and distribution side. And, so I think that the report is actually getting at a larger collection of the benefits than we often see, only looking at the power supply side. And as for the fast frequency regulation type benefits, I've been told, and maybe others on this call have more knowledge than me, that with the amount of batteries that we're installing, we're getting to where we have a gushing supply of those sorts of resources available. And in particular, in those ISOs where fossil generators are used to being paid lots of money for those services, and they're becoming very unhappy that battery vendors in Texas in particular are jumping into their market and providing for pennies what they're used to being paid dollars for.
Mhm.
Let me go on to Peter and then Myron, and maybe then we'll wrap up. We don't have a time constraint on the platform, but all of our time is valuable. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I can take this offline if you want to, but Mike, so we're in the midst of an update to 1547 for the first time since 2018. And I'm leading the part of that that has to do with vehicle to grid. We're going to be directly incorporating vehicle to grid into 1547 this time. And so I'm interested to know if you have any. I mean, we have lots of input into this group, but I'm interested to know if you have any specifics that you can identify having to do with either barriers having to do with regulation or standards, or barriers having to do with interconnection, since I have your attention. And like I said, I could take the response offline. Jim knows how to reach me.
Yeah, I think I don't have like granular feedback on that. Just that it's great news that you're incorporating V2G in that. I think we need to incorporate that into so many things, especially the standards. And
It's not easy, by the way. It's a very square
no.
peg.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on that. Yeah, and I honestly would defer most of the discussion on this to folks who have more of the standard specific expertise. I will say was hearing in this V2G forum I was at not so long ago. Some of you may have even been there. Just about adherence to a standard does not necessarily guarantee that it's things are going to be compatible, and so conformance testing and things and the need for that. And I think some of that's being dealt with this new project of the Energy Commission called Charge Yard. But yeah, just want to appreciate your work working towards those standards for sure.
Myron and then Emery.
Okay, so I think we need a recommendation for bidirectionally highly varying electricity prices, because that would turn this on. It would not need aggregators. The benefits that we talked about, which could be eaten up by the aggregators, would go directly to the consumers. Consumers are only going to participate if they're paid. The benefits, as others have pointed out, and I would add, are greater than just the distribution thing, not to say those aren't a little. For example, a benefit that batteries could do if they had better inverters, you could have grid forming inverters rather than inverters that drop off the grid when the utility system is failing, like what happened in Spain. So there are a lot of things you could do if you paid people to do it. And I think the first thing to do, the easiest thing and the first thing to do is make the rates highly dynamic and bidirectional. I know there's got a big pushback by utilities. I've been pushing this for a decade in New Orleans with no success, but that doesn't mean it's not done. It exists in Fort Collins and a few other places in the world where it's bidirectional, but it isn't dynamic. But nevertheless, it causes a lot of response. So I think it should be on the list of recommendations.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I think certainly dynamic rates, including bidirectional dynamic rates, could be a big piece of this puzzle. I would say that that recommendation is implicit, and we touch maybe more directly on it in the full discussion of the paper in um, supporting and incentivizing drivers, right? So within that is increasing the variety and enrollment capacity of programs so that there is something that basically everyone could do if they wanted to. I think a dynamic bidirectional tariff would be a really important piece of that recommend. The recommendations just don't get in the paper, don't get into that level of granularity, but I'm with you on that. I think the only caveat I have is we're cognizant of the challenges in California with legacy net energy metering tariffs and sort of offloading some of the system costs onto folks who don't maybe have rooftop solar, and so that's something I'm thinking about. I don't think that's a reason not to do it. I think it can totally be figured out, but just noting some of the complications there as well for those policy discussions.
Amory and then Hannah.
In any bidirectional exchange, excuse me, you'd really like each party to pay the other the fair market value of the services they exchange. An important part of that would be the depreciation of the battery by non-mobility services. Now, modern EV batteries are exquisitely monitored down to the cell level to make sure every cell is happy, so you never have a warranty call that would destroy the OEM's business model. Does anybody know if an OEM has or battery maker has figured out, and can we get hold of an algorithm that quantifies the decrease in battery life and capacity as a result of different kinds of V to G and every which way operation, so we can start using it in analysis?
I don't know a comprehensive resource on that, so I'm happy to have others chime in. I think we do have one reference in the paper, the buoy, which I can grab the link for and drop in the chat that suggests that the it's not always degradation, right? Some cycling can be done to maintain battery health. So I think that would be a piece of the data that would be super helpful to have
Yeah, exactly. It's
more robust.
complicated, and it ought to happen automatically as part of the transaction.
Yeah, definitely hear you on that.
Hannah, and then maybe we can wrap.
All right. Hey, thanks for this. This has been great. And just to follow up on Amory's question before I get to mine, I am doing some work on EV batteries, new EV batteries, OEMs that want to be able to use those into ancillary services and some grid services, figuring out how much degradation you have before they actually start their new home and their new vehicle, and what level their warranties are going to be. When other warranties can be impacted or whatnot. It's not exactly your question about V2G, but it's the same kind of idea of using those batteries before they get into their car. So happy to share what that I can share that's not proprietary. But my question or part of the discussion is that from the commercial point of view, from the vendor point of view, one of the things that we've had challenges with is the interoperability between vehicle and charger. So as soon as you get to V2G, there's this handshaking that goes on that's governed by the 1511.8. And that standard, whether you're in Europe or the US or elsewhere, has been very difficult to actually implement, such that you have, one car can work with another charger. Have you guys looked at that at all? Do you factor that in at all, just for the practicality of making this a reality, beyond pilots?
Yeah, I appreciate the point, and I'd say I'm aware of some of the failed handshakes, so to speak. That's getting towards the very outer edge of my expertise. But it's not to say we're not thinking about it within these policy discussions. For for the analysis, I guess you could say, some of that, it's not explicitly baked in, but when we do discount how many vehicles we have and then how many may actually be available at a particular event, something like that could be something that, sort of reduces the available, available pool. And so it's not explicit, but that could be one reason why it among the reasons that we see sort of that less than full, full enrollment availability, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It's just it's a big issue in getting this
Mhm.
over to the next phase. So
Yeah, and
great.
that's,
Thank
I
you.
would say, definitely implicit in our like keep working on the standards and make sure they work recommendation, without getting into naming 1511.8 explicitly, because they're we'd have a number soup if we tried to name all the standards
Yes.
within that recommendation. But the thing that I take heart with is folks like you are hearing that recommendation and saying this is one of the things, and so we need to keep working on this within that broader scope of the standards issues. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody here for coming, in particular, Sam for bringing the report, but to all of you for making the Electricity Brain Trust what it is, a group of people who communicate when they have something to say, ask questions when they have questions to ask, and gather this way when an interesting topic comes up. I will be posting the recording of this to the Electricity Brain Trust channel on YouTube later this afternoon. And then send it out once it's up and has a link. I'll send an announcement out to the whole list. Thank you, Sam. I mean, the thing that jumped out at me here is not everybody has to enroll, and once you're enrolled, not everybody has to participate in every event to produce billions, not millions, billions of dollars of benefit. That's a huge opportunity, and the challenge now is whether we're smart enough to take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciated being in conversation with all of you today, and appreciate the invitation from Jim. So thank you, and happy to stay in touch about this topic and other EV grid topics as well.
Great.
Great. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.